Hello, my name is Gary Seal. The topic of this presentation is called simply the truth. The reason that we're focusing on the truth is because I believe that the truth is the foundation of business in this country and in fact all over the world. Because if we don't have truth, we don't have trust. And without the trust that brings integrity and determination, we have significant issues in the way we conduct business and the viability of our business. Things like consistency, competency, the sincerity and commitment that we bring to these business relationships are fundamental. They're our bedrock in the way we do business. Now, I think it's really unique to go back in history and take a look at people who exhibited this aspect of the truth. And the guy that sticks out in my mind is Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was our president from 1901 to 1908. And from that standpoint, we wonder what drove Roosevelt, what made him to be the man that he was during his presidency, and in fact, all of his adult life. Well, if we look back in history, we find out that Roosevelt was the son of a very wealthy New Yorker, but the one thing that they had versus a lot of people that were in power in the late 1800s is a true commitment to the truth. And that came from their faith and being in church every Sunday. And so Roosevelt existed within the confines of his family for 18 to 20 years simply because he was a sickly child, and that drove him as well to build up his physique and his discipline to handle things in the real world when he got old enough and strong enough to do so. So if we look at those things, the nobility, the fact that things are right, whether things are admirable or excellent, he believed in those principles and they really made a difference throughout his life. So one of the things that happened to Roosevelt early on is that he got out and he was elected to the New York legislature, but he wasn't really sure that was going to be part of his overall livelihood for a long period of time. And he was casting about for something to do. He found a job in the United States Civil Service, got an opportunity to move to Washington, D.C. He made fast friends with Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and was traveling around the country looking for people that were violating the concept of their grants and their funding and the way they handled civil service in the country. And he was very, very good at that. However, one of the things that was going on is that he had a growing family back in New York and he was gone all the time. So quite frankly, he was looking for something else to do. He was a little concerned that this job wasn't going to take him where he wanted to go, but yet it fit his personality. Therefore, when an opportunity came up for him to become New York City Police Commissioner, it really fit because he could be back in New York City. And the police commissioners at that time, actually there were 4 of them. He was one of 4, but he was the head of that quadrant of commissioners. They were expected to follow suit with what's called Tammany Hall politics, which is actually a concept of corruption. These folks cheated on contracts, they exaggerated, they overcollected, they looked the other way towards graft and prostitution and excessive drinking and breaking the laws. But not Roosevelt. Roosevelt was out there during the nights busting corrupt cops, trying to curb in this nastiness of prostitution that was going on in the culture and curbing the strong drinking aspects of what were going on all over the country, but specifically in New York City. The Tammany Hall people said, "Oh, no, Mr. Roosevelt, we can't have this." He would have actually stayed on as commissioner or really fit with him personally, but they said, "We can't have that. We're not going to allow you to be on the police force anymore." He had an opportunity to go back to Washington, D.C., and he landed a job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It was perfect for him. He had power, he had position, and as a matter of fact, he had a higher power and authority than you would normally think for an assistant secretary, because his boss, the actual secretary, was a sickly individual, and he was really more concerned with the pomp and circumstance of the being Secretary of the Navy. Instead, Roosevelt basically stepped in and took over as secretary. One person described him as irrepressible, belligerent, and enthusiastic all at the same time. He was trying to grow the Navy and increase funding, work with Congress, work behind the scenes, that sort of thing. And he was a power to be reckoned with, besides the fact that he was a historian and had written about naval and military type activism and things that took place in American history. So he was a noted historian at this time as well. One of the things that had gone on with him is that he had never had an opportunity to be in a conflict and go to war, and he really coveted this aspect of conflict, unlike many people. There are a number of people who were looking at Spain and thought that they were belittling their Cuban country that they controlled, and also the Philippines. And so when one of our battleships blew up in Havana Harbor, that's all it took. The United States declared war on Spain, and that took place not in Spain, but in Cuba and the Philippines. So what Roosevelt did at that time, he resigned his position, went down to San Antonio, raised troops, was appointed a colonel in the United States Army, and shipped off to Cuba. Well, there were only two fights in the entire Cuban War, if you will, the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt was involved in both of them, but in the second one, he led the charge. He actually put himself at great risk, dodging bullets, shooting people, exhorting his people, and charging up the hill. Well, the American press that was following the conflict just bought into Roosevelt's bravery, hook, line, and sinker, and he became an American national hero at the time. Well, the war didn't last long. He finally shipped back, and he was casting about for something to do. At that time, the New York power brokers also needed a new governor because the previous governor has gotten himself in trouble because of graft. And they said, Theodore, we'll run you on the Republican ticket. You just have to rein it in. You can't be the busting their chops type of guy that you've been in the past in your civil service job and as New York police commissioner. And he said, okay, I'll do my best. He was elected, and he loved it. He loved being in power. New York was one of the power broker states at that time with not only wealth but population. And people tended to look at New York governors as a pathway to the presidency, and that didn't bother him at all. But Roosevelt couldn't stick with his, oh, I'll keep my hands off thing. He saw the abuses of the highly wealthy folks that ran the American economy and started meddling in there almost right away. So he, again, would have loved to have stayed as New York governor, but again, the power broker said, no, one term's enough for you, buddy. We got to find something else for you to do. So it was widely known that being Vice President of the United States was really a not very proactive, powerful job at all. But because he could not return to the New York governorship, they convinced him to run for Vice President of the United States. And he was hoping, well, perhaps if I'm Vice President for 4 years, then I can run in 1904. Well, if you look at the picture, you can almost see the sadness and just regret in his face because he wasn't really into it. However, as destiny would speak, we find out that just 10 months later, President McKinley was shot. Now, at first they thought he was going to survive, but due to the lack of medical progression at the time and understanding about infection, They allowed him to become infected, and slowly but surely he passed away. And so all of a sudden, Roosevelt finds himself as President of the United States of America, going from one of the least powerful elected jobs into one of the most powerful elected people on earth, even at the turn of the century. Well, we find that Roosevelt was a robust, go-getter type of personality. He's known from some very famous quotes. This "speak softly, carry a big stick, and you'll go far" is one that resonates with people because we have these little snippets of history. Or Roosevelt lived that out in his personal life as too. He still boxed, he wrestled with his kids, he went canoeing, rowing, wading through icy cold water, riding horseback in the cold northeastern weather. He was a really rambunctious individual, and that played out into the way he conducted himself as president. There are a lot of abuses in the turn of the century, so he had to invoke the Sherman Antitrust Act on multiple occasions. We had real issues with food contamination. He essentially set up the Food and Drug Administration and started warring against the horrible packaging practices that were taking place in the slaughterhouses. From a standpoint of looking forward, he set up the United States Forest Service and signed into law the creation of 5 national parks. He started the preservation of our natural land. The railroads were extremely powerful back then. He had to enact the Hepburn Act on more than one occasion. And you're probably aware that he also strong-armed Colombia into helping to cut the Panama Canal across the Isthmus between North and South America, a landmark thing for worldwide shipping. Now, as he stuck with this commitment to the truth throughout his administrations and his appointmentships and things of that nature, one of the things that he lived to regret was his commitment in 1904 not to run again. And as 1908 approached, he was getting Taft ready to run for president, but slowly but surely he realized that if he had not made that commitment to the country and to himself, he would have run again, because there was no law against being in office for 3 separate times. So from that standpoint, Roosevelt was a landmark president. There are a number of other cases where his personality and commitment to the truth really shone forth. As a matter of fact, if we look at what happened in the 1930s when they started dedicating Rushmore, they changed from it being a commemorative to the Indians to the top 4 presidents over the first 130 years of the country's history that embodied the faith and the existence of the country and the expansion of the country. And Roosevelt was the first modern day president to be included in that. Roosevelt stood through his entire life as a person dedicated to the truth, the working class man, and even though he had been wealthy, he lost that in a cattle ranching adventure, he never left that zeal and that practice of taking care of the folks that weren't as privileged through the administration of the truth.